All right, so welcome to the 205 lecture on Plato's Republic. Let me just jump right into it. Plato's Republic is a work of the 4th century BC. The work is famous for its discussion of justice, of the timeless forms, as we'll see, or ideas, and the philosopher kings. My intention today is to focus primarily on Plato's defense of an ethical theory of justice against the character Thrasymachus, and the philosophical and political enterprises Plato finds himself getting into to defend such a theory. On this basis, to study the Republic solely in terms of either its political or its philosophical lessons is not really to see the whole picture. Both are necessary, both the politics as well as the philosophy. In fact, I would go as far to argue that wherever philosophy is, there too is politics, and vice versa. Our political values color our philosophical understandings of the world, and our philosophical theories of truth or reality have implications for the way we think about human forms of community, political community. Nowhere is this more true than on the pages of the Republic, where the whole venture into philosophy, as we will explore today, is launched by a crisis of political and historical conscience, a crisis for Socrates and I believe for the author Plato. Before I jump into the dialogue itself, it is important to set the context of the debate. On the one hand, we have the sophists, who, like the rebellious Thrasymachus of the Republic, believe that there is no truth except what we humans make, and that democracy allows each to express their own truth. On the other hand are those like Plato and the school of the Eleatics that Plato comes out of, who argue for a permanent realm of ideas which provides a perfect and absolute standard for truth everywhere and at any time, which can only be understood by a philosophical elite. Only the philosophers have access to this. So no democracy. No political democracy and no philosophical democracy. With this, we have introduced the two camps of the sophists and the Platonics, and we may begin our descent into the dialogue. At the end of the day, when we can look at the Republic as a whole, as a theory of an ideal political community, or polis, I'll be using that term sometimes, Greek meaning city, or community, or even constitution. But the idea here is a city united by political values. And it is one based on a version of justice and judge its worth. We can judge its worth from this point of view. Plato's spokesman in the dialogue, Socrates, was actually his real-life teacher. And we will see his teacher's life and death had a great influence on his theory of truth, justice, and power. It is Thrasymachus' challenge which largely sets the stage for the Republic. Thrasymachus argues that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger, of those who rule, and that might, power, makes right. That justice, inevitably, this implies that justice is a lie or a myth to justify the power of those who currently hold it, the powerful. Thrasymachus' position is rejected by Plato's primary spokesman in the dialogue, as mentioned, Socrates, who argues that the art of rulership never takes the interest of the ruler as primary. By definition, a ruler doesn't rule for himself, by definition at least, but in the interest of the ruled. Despite his refutation of Thrasymachus' position early on in Book 1, Socrates has yet to provide a positive definition of justice and sets out to find one. With this, the work of the Republic has begun. Socrates and his main discussants, Glaucon and Adeimantus, agree to take up the search, and you'll be hearing their names as we go through this. They agree to search for justice first at the macro level, the larger level of the state, and only later to return to the micro level of the individual. If we get it, if we can see it in the big picture of the state, it'll be much easier to find it in the individual afterwards. This deductive procedure seeks the individual justice through the lens of the larger body politics and is, from this point of view, oriented towards viewing the part as part of the whole. So we have the emphasis from the Platonic point of view on the whole, and we'll see that as we go through. Socrates moves towards an understanding of justice considered aside from its rewards, with a view to the essential good and evil which justice and injustice works in the possessors of them. Thus, Socrates and his friends set out to prove that justice is not only best for the happiness it brings, its consequences, but also best in and of itself, regardless of the consequences. And this starts their inquiry into the ideal state, political community. Socrates starts by laying out the economic organization necessary for such a state to exist. He lays out the basic divisions of labor, which he holds as the conditions of life allowing any community to flourish, Greek or otherwise. Merchants, workers, and buyers all interact to provide the variety of goods necessary for life, a division of labor. Each type of labor must be performed by those whose nature best fit the work, such that the division of labor, just mentioned, most effectively utilizes the natural abilities of each citizen. Sounds kind of like a beehive. As the city's needs and wants expand into a city of unlimited desires, or a city of pigs, as Glaucon calls it, there will be a demand for an expansion of lands in order to provide for growing wants and luxury. The city is expanding, they need to invade their neighbors. With this, Socrates informs that they have discovered war to be derived from the causes which are also the causes of almost all evils in the state, private as well as public. From these beginnings of the search for justice in the state, the harmonization of differences and the suppression of conflict are taken as constitutional principles of political order. Again, for Plato, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Unity, not diversity, appears to be Plato's primary concern, at least at this point of the Republic. To the end of this material and territorial expansion of the city, a place of military training becomes necessary, and the division of labor is again applied so that those who are most fit to fight become members of the army. Socrates turns to the analogy of the courage of dogs as epitomizing spirit and bravery, and this is spirit, thumos in the Greek, in order to imagine a class and soldiers who will best prove dangerous to enemies and soft and friendly to fellow citizens. You don't want the soldiers invading the country themselves, a la Caesar. The most fitting education for the soldiers, Socrates finds in a regimen, a training of music and gymnastic. A strong program of censorship is set up in order to encourage some themes and repress others. All harmful examples of passion, irrationality, or cowardice from the poets, or the plays are to be eliminated from the education of the youth, who will become the brave defenders of the city. The state may produce myths, and the rulers censor and lie alone for the public good. The poets must be censored. Plato now pushes the dialogue onward to ask the primary political question: who shall have power? Who shall rule? He begins his search for the best rulers in holding that the best amongst the old must rule the young. Kind of reverse ageism, right? This elite should be for the common people, though not of them, right? Rulership for the people, but not by the people. At this point, Plato fashions his political myth or noble lie of the earth-born caste, his myth of the metals. Here, the young people must be taught that their training and early education was experienced inside the land, in the earth, in the ground, which has given them a specific nature: gold at the highest, silver, or at the lowest, bronze. And that the Greek soil itself, from which they were born, is their true mother, to be defended and loved, defended from enemies and loved by all. The identification with a class of metals, which applies to everybody in the polis, dictates a particular citizen's rank in society, and as well as their political status. The purity of these castes, these different levels of citizens, gold, bronze, silver, and gold, is to be guarded for Plato, as there is nothing which they should guard, Plato states, which they should guard so anxiously as the purity of the race. So these are essentially races within the city that Plato is creating in order to fill out different duties in the city. The highest rank of the guardians find their purpose, the gold level, in the protection of the constitution, which takes as its primary purpose not the disproportionate happiness of any one class, but the greatest happiness of the whole. At this point in his development, Plato is working up the basics of his state from its very foundations. In starting at the level of appetite, with material production and consumption, the lowest part of the soul, as we will see, Plato addressed his city in its lowest aspect first. That is, he works towards the ideal of justice, from the lowest levels of material exchange and human appetite. Now, with the education and role of the warrior class, the military, he has moved upwards to the second level, from appetite and desire, moved up to the second level of the passions, right? From the lower level of the working classes, right? And their desires, their animal appetites. In contemplating his four highest virtues, right, which he considers justice to be one of them, courage, wisdom, justice, and finally temperance or balance, Socrates declares justice to be discovered in the divisions of the state itself, eureka. Justice here is seen in the differentiation of the city into its various specialized tasks. And famously, justice here then, and for all times for Plato, is each part doing what it does well, right? Unhampered and unbothered by other parts of the city or other classes. In terms of class functioning, this means that the laboring class obeys, the brave warriors defend, and the wise guardians alone rule, each of these in harmony with the other, creating the overall good of the whole. Having found justice in the state, Socrates and his companions now return to the question of justice in the individual soul, at the individual level. Can Thrasymachus be right that power is the privilege of the powerful individual? Justice is the prerogative of the individual, that might makes right. So now we have to return to the justice at the individual level. To begin, Socrates moves to articulate the structures of the soul, right, within the individual. Those structures of the self which he claims make up all people. The three classes found in the state have an equivalence, right, a counterpart at the level of the soul, and are translated into appetite, emotions, and intellect. In short, within the individual, the animal, which would relate to the working class in the city, the emotional, which would be in the soul, which has its equivalent in the city, in the army, and the intellectual within the person, which would be the guardians, the philosophers in the city. Right? As it goes in the city, so goes in the individual. As the just state, so goes the individual. It will not cheat, nor lie, nor steal, so long as each part functions to carry out its own business, unimpeded and in harmony with its counterparts. It is only with the meddlesomeness and interference of the inferior in the rising up of a part of the soul against the whole that the soul is rendered into corruption and deformity. Clearly, civil war and civil strife, civil unrest, is a massive concern for Plato. And this was certainly something that was a great problem in Greece before, during, and after Plato's time. Right? Class war, I think, is a simple way of calling it out. Justice in the soul as in the state means that each part of him is doing its business, whether in ruling or being ruled. Right? A phrase that Aristotle will later use, ruling and being ruled. With this, Socrates declares that Thrasymachus' equation of domination with strength, that might makes right, and that happiness comes with this domination, has been defeated, as it serves no one to be miserable and sickly, either of body or soul. The soul of the just person and the just city must find harmony within itself. And if any part is out of place or out of balance, the whole and happiness becomes impossible, and misery is the result. So the unjust individual and the unjust city cannot be to anybody's advantage. In response to his colleagues' insistence, right, at the time, and this point in the dialogue, they now return to the question of the state. Declaring the issue of class conflict in the city resolved, Socrates restates his confidence in the overall harmony of the city itself, where all are of one opinion about what is near and dear to them. They all tend towards a common end, right? A happy polis family. With this, Glaucon moves to ask how Socrates has actually made the case that their ideal state is possible, given real human history and human nature as they knew them, right? How do we bring this ideal down to earth? With this, the quintessential Platonic moment of the dialogue has arrived. Here we begin to fathom, to understand the interaction of the timeless universal ideal of the good, which we will discuss soon, on the one side, and the historical manifestations and forms of justice within the polis on the other, right? and their prospects for actually bringing the ideal justice down to earth and making it work, right? That is, how do we make compatible the ideal, right, which exists for the mind, and the real that we see in history? How do we bring these two together? Okay. With so much of the life and ordering of the polis family described, some of which I've left out, right, in terms of Plato's common holding of wives, the sharing of wives, the communism of property, right, and the organization of mating. Plato very carefully organizes who can mate with whom, right? What has arrived is a consideration of the viability, right, the feasibility of the ideal state, the just state. Does its status as an ideal make it a historical impossibility? Do we have to give up on the heavenly city here on earth, down on earth? Does a conflict between his ideal and the ideal, between his ideal and the real, the real, run through time, through history, so as to make Plato's ideal city foolish, as many have and continue to this day to claim? That is, to what universal and timeless map, an absolute, can reason, the mind, refer in order to plot the good political course through history that Plato aspires to? It is the metaphysical and philosophical question of the conceptual foundations of justice. How can we know it for the mind? For the polis, which Plato now has to address. Where is this truth that Plato is going to make reference to? The interplay of the real and the ideal, what Socrates calls in the Republic the third and greatest wave that they have to face, is now the main task and challenge of the Republic. History is clearly in rebellion against the realization of Plato's idealistic words and dreams of a just city. Nevertheless, he claims that just because such a state has never existed, we've never seen it, through and explain each of these moments within the cave. In Plato's cave, or in society as he knew it, humans unknowingly carry out underground lives, living in the deep dark of the cave. Their arms and heads are bound, as we can see with the prisoners at the very lowest level on my left, and their gazes are fixed upon a wall upon which the shadows of real objects are cast. A group of presenters, the second level, or the roadway, group of presenters creates these shadows by manipulating objects and puppets between a bright fire and the wall where the shadows fall. It sounds a little bit like the way television operates, at least if you see the world like Noam Chomsky does. For the audience, the shadows cast on the wall, the prisoners, are taken as the true reality, the real world. Voices are projected into the cinema, this theater, in association with the shadow images, and are taken as coming from the shadow objects themselves. This social and sensory indoctrination, or education, amounts to the world of nurture for Plato, and would perhaps be best represented by education, law, art, media, tradition, and other social and political institutions which form our collectively held worldviews. Right? We come to know the world not as free philosophers out in the real world, but as prisoners who've been indoctrinated by the views and conventions and political biases of society. Even when released from this captivity, the prisoners, right, and they're captive to custom, convention, and their sensual forms of perception, right? The eyes lie about the ideas. It's only with the mind that we can know them. Even when they're liberated, the prisoners refuse to give up the lessons that they learned in the cave. Should these same captives be dragged out of the cave, right, onto the level up there with the philosopher, they would be blinded and go mad. For those who escape the limits of their cave, such as the philosopher here, their new point of reference will take time to and to finally embrace, right? It takes time to open your eyes to the bright light of the sun of truth. Right? Slowly they will come to see the light of day, the truth of being, or the highest good, right? And they naturally come to understand its primacy, right? The philosopher gains access to this higher truth as a compass and a frame of reference, a point of reference for human judgment, both political as well as philosophical, right? Having come to this startling escape, the newly liberated person now sets their sight upon returning to the cave. Once you escape, you need to go back in to rescue their former fellows. Such a return to the cave, Plato warns, would be laughed at as ridiculous and denounced as heretical. by virtue of the philosopher's challenge to the customs of the traditional polis. He's not welcome. He goes back in, he says, I have a different vision, or she says, we have a different vision of the truth, and the prisoners laugh at them and say, no, we prefer our theater of fantasy. Such a mission, Plato makes clear, would likely end in the philosopher's death, who would be treated as a revolutionary enemy or terrorist of the state, threatening the status quo, even though they actually see more, right? Clearly, Plato had not forgotten the lesson of his teacher's plight. Socrates, who was sentenced to death to take the poison hemlock for his heterodox, his unorthodox, his unusual, perhaps even revolutionary teachings, right? And this is the voice of Socrates, right? The voice of Plato in the Republic is his teacher, right? In the name of Socrates. In Plato's ideal city then, the statesman, the politician, requires ultimate knowledge of the idea of the good in order to be capable of rational political judgment. And before you can have that, you need to escape this political, right, prison. And that is society, right? Real-world society for Plato. In having read and seen the eternal truth in the final good and the forms, right, the philosopher returns to the cave of the polis with a blueprint for its reform and ultimately its perfection. The philosopher here must rule as a king and as the one who has exclusively received the highest education. Not everybody can be a philosopher, and that, of course, is true and obvious from the myth of the metals. In this way, Plato delivers his justification as to how one who has been reared to the guardian class, brought up as a member of the guardians, and has attained the highest happiness of truth, must now be persuaded to give up their comfortable, perhaps even beautiful life as a philosopher, contemplating truth, and to return to essentially the hell, right? The hell of the cave and the world of suffering, actually, for Plato, down there in the cave where we are tortured by the senses and by our fellow citizens and all of our appetites and dominating desires. For Plato and Socrates and the members of the discussion, the true guardians, the philosophers, have been found, and Plato considers his case for the practicality of a city complete. So let me bring this to conclusion, right, with a couple pages of commentary. Where Thrasymachus had started out in arguing for the rulership, that rulership is essentially the art of exploiting the ruled, Plato has turned this position around on its head, so that the rulers are themselves committed to the rule of the forms as an ultimate ethical authority, right? In this sense, the philosopher for Plato is as much a political agent as a prophet, conducting the sight of the community up to the light of the sun of ideas, through the practice of philosophy and dialectic. And dialectic simply is the practice of reason at the highest level of the line. The absence of the heavenly city, of the ideal forms in history, right? The absence of his ideals in the real world is a kind of purgatory, a permanent purgatorial existence for us. We're neither in heaven nor hell for Plato, and we can never really enter one or the other. In fact, for Plato, it's more hell than heaven. This condition for Plato witnesses the tragic alienation of humanity from its own essential nature and spiritual potentials, right? Until we realize the ideal city, right, we kind of live in a hell of our own making, and we are alienated. We are alienated from ourselves, we're alienated from each other, and alienated from nature and the cosmos around us. We can never truly note them, right? We must admit, though, that Platonic justice, as we see it completed here, is not attained through the willing agency of its citizens or their consultation. Rather, it is found at the level of the organization of the polis as a whole, right, as a kind of organism. And this organization brings citizens into conformity with the ideal which few citizens alone understand, right? In this rule of the one of justice over the many of freedom, Plato sets his city against what he sees as the ugly and inevitable consequences of democratic pluralism, right? The few cannot rule, the few must rule, the many must be ruled, and their voices essentially must be silenced, right? It's hard to see it otherwise. The realization of the ideal polis is brought about through the spiritual unification of the potentialities of its citizens, and not merely through an education which takes those individual potentialities as ends in themselves. From this angle, the citizens, Plato's citizens, seem to exist for the city and not the city for the citizens. This distinction draws a marked line of contrast between the most basic individualist presumptions of modern liberal education, such as those we enjoy and struggle with at AUB, and Plato's radical concern for unity and the preservation of harmony of the polis family, seemingly at any cost, right? Freedom has no place, with the exception perhaps of the ideas which exist in freedom. All others, perhaps even the philosopher kings, must follow the dictate of the ideas themselves. Despite this critical note, Plato's concern was first and foremost with the frequency of strife. Let's put it in context of Plato's time. The frequency of strife, conflict, and civil war of his day. Things were really rough well before Plato arrived on the scene, and he is a philosopher seeking tranquility for the Greek states and especially for Athens. Nonetheless, and despite this contextualization, it is difficult not to see strong class prejudices in Plato's political order, as it is often explicitly expressed in his strong distaste and distrust of the middle classes and the working classes. Plato and later Aristotle, his student, were big critics of what he considered to be manual labor, or the banausic class, those that work with their hands. There were those who did, and there were those who thought, and never the two should meet. To bring all this together into a kind of analysis of the structure and design of the Republic as a whole, we may see that the Republic as a whole may be seen as a reflection of the revolutionary implications of the allegory of the cave, of the parable of the cave, and the hierarchy of the knowledge illustrated in the doctrine of the divided line. In essence, the whole Republic, the structure of the Republic, follows this ascension. The movement of the dialogue from the conventional sphere of becoming, of change, to that of the ideal unity and permanence of being, of the truth, reveals a teaching and philosophical strategy at work behind the Republic as a whole. Right? There is actually a philosophical method that organizes the structure of the dialogue. Plato slowly refocuses our eyes from the historical level of custom and convention to the ideal horizon of philosophy, which is where the Republic ends, and it takes us from the earthly, right, from the sensual, up to the heavenly and the intellectual. This overall build-up from convention and custom to ideal, is a reflection of the movement of the soul, from the appetites to the passions, with final perfection accomplished in reason. Right? And each of these represented by a particular caste, a particular class within society. The laborers, the warriors, and the philosopher kings. The myth of the metals secures this hierarchy with greatest concern for class integration and harmony within the polis, a kind of caste system. Here, caste is given a kind of mythological legitimacy, where humans are by nature born to a prescribed and predestined duty and station within society. Thus far, Plato has remained within the bounds of conventional Greek values and has yet to provide, at this point within the dialogue, the development of the castes, he has yet to provide a justified foundation, an intellectual or philosophical justification for his hierarchy of knowledge. The search for an ideal city and of an ideal justice within it necessarily creates the need to justify his educational and class constructs. He's come up with his political and educational values. He needs a philosophical program of truth to justify it. Can I ask you to stop over there for a few minutes until I finish? Thanks. With this, right? With this need for a metaphysical program, a philosophical program to satisfy the question of what is justice and how politics can work in the city, the center of the dialogue, really the center and central purpose of the dialogue, makes its appearance at the end of the dialogue. With this, a second state in the Republic is begun with Plato's plan to found a city on a system of absolute universals, his forms, which give meaning to all his educational, legal, economic, and institutional arrangements. Right? The dialogue has finally moved through the transition from the conventional to the ideal, and from the valley of Greek experience to the mountains, right, of the mind, right, which is where Plato seeks to plant authority. Plato's protagonist, Socrates, then tackles the greatest challenge to his theory of the just state. What is the ideal ground and form of legitimate authority that only the mind can know and which has never been historically seen? It is not until this moment that the philosopher has played any substantial role in the construction of the city. The philosopher is kind of an afterthought, but a necessary one. Only with philosophical training does the mind arrive at the conflict between sensory appearance and intellectual reality, right? Appearance and reality are two different things for Plato. We have to shut our eyes to appearance in order to see reality. And only with this are philosophers capable of gaining the perspective needed to witness the ideal forms which order the world, right, and give meaning to it. This evolution Plato took as a model for the foundation of an elite philosophical education, to raise the mind from its captivity in the many impressions of the senses, and by extension, to ultimately emancipate the polis as a whole from the wants, interests, and opinions of its many members which plague it with internal conflict. Democracy needs to be suppressed. Diversity needs to be suppressed. Conversation in the lecture hall needs to be suppressed. Just kidding. Where Plato strove to bring the heavenly pattern of the ideal forms down to earth, philosophical and political legitimacy are intertwined, right? Politics and philosophy become brother and sister. So as to bring an end to the soul's captivity in the purgatory of the shifting sands of public opinion and sensory perception, where appearances, where the senses tyrannize over the truth, right? Where the senses tyrannize the mind. Plato's grand narrative of the state, then, is first and foremost a project where political problems are subjected to the logic of philosophical resolution for remedy. The two are inseparable for a truly Platonic understanding of the Republic, and that's why I give you the politics of the Republic and not just the philosophical contents that I think you're going to focus on in your readings. The cave dwellers to which he addresses himself are his fellow Athenians and Greeks, and the Republic itself becomes the educational exercise of the philosopher who has returned to the cave to seek the spiritual emancipation of his countrymen by political means, right? So in many ways, the Socrates in the Republic, through Plato, is doing exactly what Plato recommends the philosopher do with the cave, return to it, and the Republic itself becomes a kind of message to the Greek world on Plato's behalf. On my reading, then, Plato, the author of the Republic, is the selfsame heroic philosopher king of the Republic. In many ways, the vengeance of the Republic is set on redeeming the honor and spirit of Plato's teacher, Socrates, who was put to death for his philosophical views and teachings. Right? To close, then, let me leave you with two takeaway questions. One, has Plato really made a persuasive case for his ideal forms? Does he really give us a foundation, right? Not merely a skeleton structure to think about them, but actually an honest-to-goodness method for acquiring knowledge of the forms. And on the other hand, is there, with or without the forms, is there a basis for us to be comfortable with, to accept his political arrangements, right? And some of the questionable issues that arise with his suppression of diversity. With that, I thank you for your patience and enjoy the rest of your course. Thank you.